Hey everyone, this is Chris Mooney, and today we're going to talk about the Great Designer Search 3 Challenge Number 1. Even though this is Challenge Number 1, it's kind of the second round. The first round, or the first unofficial round, was the design test to get into the top 8. Thank you for all of the positive responses on that last video. I hope that you enjoyed this one as well. This week we're going to spend a little bit less time on each card individually because they were all so interconnected. Alright, so let's go over this challenge really quickly. We're not going to read it word for word, but basically we each had to choose a creature type, ideally one that hasn't seen a lot of love in Magic's history, and design tribal cards for that creature type. For anyone who doesn't know, tribal means that it's a card that cares about the creature type. All 8 of our cards had to be mechanically related to that creature type. So if we picked Vidalcan, we couldn't simply make a creature that was a Vidalcan or a card that made Vidalcan tokens or something. It had to be a card that cared about creatures that had the Vidalcan type. Additionally, we had some restrictions on rarity. We had to make 2 of each rarity. We had to use at least 2 colors. We had to make at least 1 of each of these 6 different card types, and then the last 2 could be any type that we wanted. Lastly, we had a restriction on keyword mechanics. We were only allowed to use evergreen mechanics and up to 2 non-evergreen mechanics. I didn't have to go too far to figure out what the judges were looking for this time because they actually put the criteria right here after the challenge. So they were looking for flavorful design, fun gameplay, synergy, and then originality, color palette appropriateness, rarity appropriateness, and card type appropriateness. I always got the feeling that these criteria were sort of sorted into 2 categories. These first 3 are the specific criteria for this challenge. These are the things that they're looking for us to deliver on this challenge. Whereas these 4 down here, basically, we should always be doing these. It's just a good reminder to say, hey, you might get called out for this if you don't do it properly. So the first step of this challenge was picking a tribe. The way that I went about that was literally I pulled up a list of every creature type in Magic and I just skimmed through here and sort of looked for what would be interesting. So when looking through all of these card types, there were a couple of things that I was trying to keep in mind. First, we could only make 3 creatures total, which meant that whatever creature type we picked had to have a decent showing in Magic's history. You know, if I picked a creature type that only had a handful of cards, well, it would be hard to really show off what those creatures should be doing. In order to make it a little easier on myself, I looked specifically for a tribe that had mechanical and flavorful resonance, something that I wouldn't have to spend a lot of time and effort to justify what I was doing. There's a little bit of appeal in picking a creature type that doesn't really have an identity because you can create whatever you want. But I felt like it was going to be a lot more successful in this challenge if I went with something that was well known and especially something that, you know, even a non-Magic player might be able to understand. I looked at a ton of other creature types. Funnily enough, none of the creature types that I looked at were chosen by any of the other competitors. So we were all on very different pages there. So that's what led me to my final choice, which was Oozes. Oozes are very resonant. And that resonance has been represented on a variety of different cards in a variety of different ways. So it was my challenge to take those cards and try to combine them together into something that functioned like a cohesive unit. Once I figured out that I was going to go with Oozes, my next step was to create a list of things that I felt were associated with Oozes. So here's a list of all of the Ooze tropes, the flavorful things that people associate with Oozes. All of the Oozes in Magic right here are sorted into the different categories. My goal was to try and hit on as many of these categories as I could in my 8 cards. The 2 tropes that were hit on the most is that Oozes are ever-growing and Oozes are consuming. These 2 things were, you know, as I said, have been represented a lot in Magic's history, and I felt were a good jumping-off point for my Ooze cards. I also thought about what kind of a deck that Oozes would feel like. If you had a deck that was full of only Oozes, what should it play like? And I sort of came into this feeling of it would probably play a little bit like the Blob. When the Oozes are coming for you, they're usually one big mass. And if it does split up, that's because that big mass is being divided and maybe it'll come back together, but it will keep growing and it will overtake you. And so that sort of led me to this feeling of the Ooze deck sort of wants all of its creatures to be interchangeable, or at very least to sort of feed into each other. and that they could combine and then divide and shift from one to another, and that would sort of give you the feeling of being this ooze that no matter what you do is always going to grow back and consume you. So something that seemed really key to the identity of oozes was growth. But oozes tended to grow in slightly different ways. Like we had a lot of oozes that grew tall, like Scavenging Ooze, but we also had a lot of oozes that grew wide, like Mitotic Slime. And we had oozes that did both, like Splitting Slime. So it was kind of up to me to decide how were we going to combine these two ideas. And that's sort of where the growing tokens concept came from. A lot of cards made XX Ooze tokens. Usually we represent those with a token card and a die on them. So that sort of led me to the idea of, hey, if we're already gonna put dice on our tokens, why don't we have those dice actually be +1/+1 counter? So instead of creating XX Ooze tokens, which is the norm, what if we created 0/0 Ooze tokens and then we put +1/+1 counters on them to represent their size? It would basically be the same logistically, but it would allow us to interact with all of our cards together. There was a small point in my design process where every single ooze was a 0/0 that entered with +1/+1 counters, just so that there would never be any confusion as to how big the creatures were. But that was a little too confusing even for me. So our two tropes, again, were consuming and ever growing. So when I went to look at mechanics, I took a look around, but it seemed pretty obvious to me that the mechanic that I wanted was Devour. Devour literally was perfect for this tribe. Not only is devouring one of the most resonant things that an ooze can do, but Devour played into both of my themes perfectly well. It fed into the sacrifice and consuming theme, but also the growing and +1/+1 counter theme. It was just a perfect fit, and once I found it, I never really looked back. I did spend some time thinking about Proliferate. The more I thought about it, the more that proliferating seemed like something that might be in the set adjacent to the oozes, but it wouldn't really be part of the ooze tribe. That was a big part of the challenge. You couldn't create a lot of support cards for your tribe unless they specifically called out your, creature type. I knew that once I picked Devour that it wasn't really received that well the first time around, so I was going to have to find something new to do with it, or at very least use it very carefully. So before we go on to making the cards, the last thing I want to talk about is my color choice. When it came to oozes, green was a completely obvious choice. Most oozes are green. They constantly grow and expand and consume things around them. Not even necessarily in a malicious way, but just that's what they do. They just are always growing. So when it came to picking my second choice, I thought black was obvious, mostly just because of flavor and precedence. Turns out that in Magic's history, black hasn't actually had a ton more oozes than red. But the red oozes are all pretty old and are kind of outdated, so black definitely felt like the right choice from both a flavor and a precedent standpoint. Now, I only needed 2 colors. Obviously, in hindsight, I think that would have been the better choice. The reason why I decided to add in blue is basically because I felt like it was an expectation. My first instinct was that, I was going to have to pick between black and blue as my secondary color because they both have a lot of oozes. But it turns out that blue actually doesn't have very many oozes. In fact, it basically has 0 ooze cards at all. There are a couple of green-blue cards that make oozes, and in particular, there are 2 legendary creatures, the Mimeoplasm and Experiment Kraj, that are both very high-profile blue oozes, which is what I think gave me that feeling in my mind. But in reality, blue wasn't really key to the ooze tribe. I do think that players would expect oozes to be blue, or that they would at least have some support in blue. I certainly think that if I was going to make a ooze commander, I would want it to be all 3 colors and not just black and green. It's possible that for this challenge, I should have just stuck to the 2 colors that I knew I wanted to use. And when we get into talking about the individual cards, we'll go over some more reasons for that. Alright, so now we can take a look at my individual cards. Again, for this challenge, because the cards were all designed to work together, I'm not going to spend too long talking about each card individually. Shout out to our guest judge, Alexis Jansen, winner of the first Great Designer Search. I'm not going to spend the time to go over everything that I talked about in my blurb here, but if you're interested in knowing more about, my design process and the card, you should definitely read this. And honestly, you should probably read the entire article first before watching this video, but we're going to take you through it anyway. Booster Shot, I thought was a really cool common design. I totally missed this rules issue. And honestly, it should have just been the simple version of the wording. It should have just given +2/+2 until end of turn, but if it was an Ooze, it got counters instead. Again, I got caught up in that cleverness from the last round. It wasn't as big a trap this time as it was last time, but this was a card that could have been simple, could have been a home run if I just went with the simple version, but instead I tried to do something that was clever and sort of got burned for it. Recycling Slime is a very key card in this set because it plays a lot of roles. It is the only mono black Ooze card. It is the only Devour creature card, you know, a traditional Devour card. And it helps you get your Ooze creatures back from the graveyard, which plays into the sacrifice and death themes of the set. So this was a very key card. Even though the judges didn't feel super excited about it, it was really important that it was here as a representation of how this deck would work. It's doing a lot of different things, and I think that that's an important thing for people to remember if you're doing this challenge at home or just in general. You need to make sure that all of your bases are covered, and this card covers a lot of my bases in this challenge. When it comes to slime time, I think the main takeaway here is that everything that the judges said to do with this card would have made it a better card. This was definitely a card that started out as, hey, redistributing your +1/+1 counters seems cool. It actually used to be an enchantment that did this, but we realized that that was way too fiddly. It's kind of funny because when we play tested this card was like, oh, well, it's really annoying to do this every turn. Let's make sure we only have to do it once. We were blinded by the original fiddliness of the card that we didn't realize that the replacement was still super fiddly. You still have a hard to play with card, and that should have been something that I sought to improve. Something that Alexis talked about in her comments on my cards was that she really wanted to see a mono blue Ooze. I did create a number of fake commons and uncommons to pad my playtesting decks, but even then I didn't really ever create an interesting blue Ooze. I sort of always intended the blue on Oozes to be a sort of tertiary color. I think in reality it should have just been not here at all. Getting rid of blue definitely would have helped out my next card, which is Famished Fen. In general, I think that the judges felt decent about it. It needs some tweaking. So something that Mark Rosewater said was, I'm not sure you need the rigmarole of having to filter color and then cast an Ooze with the mana from this card. The reason why this land filters mana is because if an Ooze deck is truly 3 colors, then you don't have a lot of like land slots to spare. You know, you can't really have a taps for colorless land in your deck if you need all 3 of those colors. So this land really needed to tap for 3 colors, but if it was just a straight up tri-land, then it might have to enter the battlefield tapped, which is a lot of extra text. We don't even get tri-lands that enter the battlefield tapped with a bonus. Entering the battlefield tapped is just standard fare for a tri-land. I think I missed the obvious choice, which was just get rid of blue. If I got rid of blue, the Ooze deck would just become green-black. And then you do open up a little bit more space to have pure colorless lands. That wouldn't have fixed Melissa's complaint, which is that the land needs to be good both early and late. Like, you don't want this stuck in your hand. I was hoping that the fact that it fixed for colors would sort of offset this. Ultimately, I feel like this is another one of those cards where I should have picked something clear for it to do, rather than trying to allow it to do a bunch of different things. One of the comments that really stuck with me was this one from Alexis. I'm not excited to do this thing, and there's a lot of fiddly bits and decision points to support doing this not very exciting thing. Make your complexity pay off. And really that end part, make your complexity pay off, is the big lesson here. It's okay if cards are complicated to understand, if once you understand them, they're doing something that's really cool. A lot of the times my cards are complex, and then once you understand them, they only do something that's kind of cool. Like, this land is really interesting. You can eat your own creature and then feed it to another creature that you play later. That effect is not an effect that's so exciting that it justifies the confusing parts of this design. And that is something that I struggled with before this challenge, and I will probably continue to struggle with. If you remember back to my list of Ooze tropes, the sort of dissolving Ooze is another very common and very resonant one. You can see right here are 2 representations of it, very conveniently stacked next to each other, with acidic slime being probably the most marquee. That idea of an Ooze being just completely acidic and dissolving is what led me to this concept of Death Touch and Trample. For anyone who doesn't know, Death Touch and Trample is a very potent combination that basically allows your creature to just run straight through anything that blocks it. I thought it was a really flavorful representation of this ability. You know, you can imagine an acidic ooze just punching through your lines, and no matter what you put in front of it, it immediately just dissolves into the ooze. You know, unfortunately, with no flavor text, no art, I don't think I really got that idea across, especially since the name is sort of generic so that it works as an aura. And I think that that really hurt this design. I think if I had justified your ooze turns into an unstoppable, dissolving monstrosity, that they might have been a little bit more accepting of the death touch and trample, though obviously the problem with that was had more to do with rules than with flavor. So if any of you watched the last video or remember the last challenge, I had a card called Friendly Treefolk, and Friendly Treefolk utilized a very non-intuitive interaction between its damage prevention ability and trample. And the judges were saying, hey, this is the focus of the card, it should probably not be an uncommon. So I took their advice, and I made another card that had a complicated interaction with trample, and this time I put it on rare. I think ultimately the lesson here is just don't make cards with trample on them. No. The lesson here is you should avoid making cards where part of the point of them is a weird rules interaction pretty much at any rarity. It's cool that Death Touch and Trample combine in this way, but you should probably leave it to players to discover that on their own by combining cards rather than putting it together on a card and forcing players that might not understand it to have to learn what it does. So for Cell Divider, I want to talk about something very specific. I want to talk about Melissa's comment right here. I don't like the mana cost in the trigger. I don't think you need it. It adds complexity, and it makes it a less exciting mythic rare. So Cell Divider didn't always have this cost attached to its trigger. In fact, it's something I added kind of late. And I added it because of comments that the judges gave in the last round. In general, they were pretty positive on the addition of costs like this for two reasons. One, because it gave shields down moments where your opponent might be able to do something to combat your powerful effect if you happen to be tapped out. But they also liked it because of development knobs, because there were numbers that the development team could take and alter. Play design can do that even if it's not written on the original design. But if you put it on the original design, their reasoning was that it was showing that it was something you thought about. This is just a small thing, but it's something that is important for me to remember moving forward, which is that all advice has context, all rules of thumb have context, all heuristics have context, and you need to be respectful of that. Don't just go strapping on extra mana abilities when they don't need to be there, because that's what somebody did last round. Hey, this is Chris from the future. Just coming in here to make a quick comment about something I forgot to talk about when I recorded the first draft of the video. As Eli pointed out many times, a lot of my cards are completely broken with doubling season. People are wondering, was I aware of that? Did I foresee that? The short answer is yes. I play Commander, so I'm pretty aware of the existence of doubling season. We can't design around doubling season forever. So I think at this point, it's better to just move forward, make the best cards that you can, and I mean, if doubling season breaks it, just gonna have to run more enchantment removal. So my last card is Dr. Ooze's Lab. I just wanted to talk about this card because I think of all of the cards it went through the most changes. Dr. Ooze's Lab originally was a card called Dr. Ooze, and it had basically this exact same text, but it was on a creature. This mythic artifact slot used to be a card called Ooze Cannon. It was a fun concept. The idea was basically that, you shot your oozes at the opponent's creature. The problem is that I just could not for the life of me get that card to work in a way that wasn't either completely broken and oppressive or just very bad. And the closer I got, the wordier it got, which is the sense that you're probably barking up the wrong tree. Eventually, I determined that my three creatures were going to be, Nutritious Slime, Recycling Slime, and Cell Divider. So I didn't have room for Dr. Ooze anymore, and that meant, hey, what if we just took Dr. Ooze's abilities and put it on an artifact? Because it would work exactly the same. The end result was fine. I mean, it basically was exactly the same as the creature with all of the same upsides and all of the same problems. I think, again, it could have lost the blue because since it was no longer a legendary creature, it didn't have to be all three colors to be the correct commander identity. Personally, I kind of feel like copying things is a very Ooze-like ability, but if I had justified that more on the card, then maybe Mark Rosewater wouldn't have been down on the concept. This again is one of those cards that came from the idea that we were going to have a lot of Ooze tokens with counters on them, and I think the fact that so many of those didn't make the final draft, which again, I think was for the best, probably means that this card should have changed as well. Alright, so lastly, let's talk about the overall judge commentary. Starting with Eric, I just want to say that this is probably one of the most helpful, eye-opening pieces of advice that I've ever received, because we did do a lot of playtesting in this round. And like he says, we zeroed in on the fun part of playing with oozes, which is that sort of mad scientist feeling where you're creating the oozes and then sacking one to feed it to another and growing them exponentially over time. But I didn't stop to think about an opponent that didn't want to deal with that. It sounds kind of silly. It sounds kind of obvious now that why wouldn't you think about the opponent's feelings? But I think often we avoid designs that make our opponents feel bad or helpless or, you know, just miserable. But I was thinking about that aspect as a player, and I wasn't thinking about it as a designer. My oozes are a lot of fun for people who love oozes, but for somebody who doesn't like counting up, like, you know, 20 dice on little, like, you know, spread out across the table, that player might be super miserable. Just like they might be from suffering like a lockdown enchantment or whatever. So this comment definitely affected the way that I designed from this point forward. Thinking about, is this card going to make my opponent feel bad, not just from their losing sense, but from they don't want to play the game anymore sense. Melissa commented on the fiddliness, which is the big problem with my set for sure. We want to avoid pennies on nickels or too many different tokens with +1/+1 counters on them. When I designed this set of cards, my idea was that by making a lot of these types of tokens, that I would actually be alleviating the problem a little bit. Part of the problem with that thinking is that even if we did give everyone a whole bunch of 0/0 ooze tokens, this problem still applies, which is that there's going to be a ton of board states that are, hey, you have a bunch of ooze tokens with different dice on them, and, you know, maybe you don't have enough ooze tokens, maybe you don't have enough dice, so now the board state just becomes, you know, impossible to read. Because all of these cards were meant to come from the same set, I gave myself a pass on this sort of confusion, and that was a mistake. I was thinking about it too much as a challenge submission and less as cards that would actually get printed. An entire tribe of this stuff doesn't really make it better, it makes it worse. It makes it more confusing as opposed to making it easier to track. Alexis's comment really threw me for a loop. This first sentence, you know, felt very left down. But then she says, you had a few cards I'd really like to try out, and cards that hint in a fun way to play Unlimited. Overall, I'd love to give Theoretical Ooze Tribal Set a try. Thank you. I think that this is the type of comment that you just need to get used to taking. Unlike maybe some reality shows where the judges try to exaggerate to get a good reaction out of the audience, the judges here really are giving you their honest opinion. And in this case, her honest opinion was, I was disappointed that you missed this stuff, but some of your other stuff was great. So thank you. And I'm sorry that I wasn't able to deliver on the things you were looking for. So lastly, we have Mark Rosewater, probably the biggest Ooze fan out there. So I'm glad that I didn't disappoint. I think that Mark Rosewater's comments hit the nail on the head when it comes to a problem that I have as a designer and a problem that I see a lot of other people struggling with as well. I've been playing Magic for a long time. My playtesters are very experienced as well. When we playtest cards, it's very difficult for us to put ourselves back in the mind of somebody who's just starting out. These cards are totally playable in my play group, where everybody brings, you know, I have a box full of tokens that I bring, everybody brings dice, and you never have a problem representing the board state in my group. But in a new player group, somebody who just, you know, went out and bought like the intro deck for this set and built an ooze, how are they gonna play with these cards, right? There's very little to assist them, even if you put a bunch of tokens in the pack. So I think that that's something that it's very difficult. It's probably one of the most difficult parts of the job, and you just gotta practice it. Every time you make a card, you have to think about, how is a brand new player gonna read this? So coming out of the first round, I did not feel very confident at all. There were a ton of great designs there, and I got a lot of harsh and very deserved criticism. I was prepared to be going home in the first round. You know, thanks for playing, kid. Hope to see you next time, right? After I designed my oozes and submitted them, I felt pretty good about them, but I wasn't really sure what the other designers were going to show up with. The design tests were only 10 cards, and they were designed under very different circumstances. So, you know, you only have one data point. You can't really get a sense of how the other designers are going to design. When this challenge came out and I read that I was in third place, I got a big confidence boost. I felt like, you know, I was getting better. You know, Mark Rosewater in his wrap-up says that I improved over last week, which I think is pretty clear. Reading through the other competitors' designs, I felt like, you know, third place was the right place for me. I do think a lot of the other designers' submissions weren't as strong as their submissions to the first design test. I was feeling good. I felt like I might be able to stick it out for a couple more weeks. My instincts on the judges were that basically they all liked my cards, but that the complexity and the fiddliness of them was what was dragging it down. So going into next week, that was what I kept in my mind. Keep with the cool ideas, but trim down all of that complexity. So thanks for watching again, everyone. I really appreciate all of the support that you've given me thus far. I hope that these videos are informative and entertaining. My plan is to keep doing them. As always, you know, like, comment, subscribe, that YouTube stuff. You can find me on Twitter. Thanks again. Tune in next week to see if I can actually deliver on my goal of being less fiddly. But until then, thanks for watching.